He normally takes the 10 o'clock slot here in Sunday school, but he's gone, and next week he'll be doing double duty in the morning as I'm doing it this morning, because I'll be gone and he'll be home. So, and I want to extend a welcome to the Foxalls visiting up from Auburn Hills, Pontiac area in Michigan. They're visiting the Rollinsons, so if you don't know these folks, introduce yourself to them this morning. You'll be blessed. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 in the New Testament, it describes a bishop in the church or an elder in the church as an individual who, in verse 2, must be given to hospitality and apt to teach. In Titus chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul describes church leaders, he adds a little bit to that description. He says in verse 9 that elders in the churches should be, verse 8, holy and temperate. Verse 9, holding fast the faithful word as they have been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to confute, or to convince the gainsayers or the opposers. For there are many unruly and vain talkers and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not for filthy lucre's sakes. Now the situation has changed a little bit since the days of the Apostle Paul. Instead of the circumcision, Jewish people who are spreading their unique doctrines, although there are Orthodox Jews in Sault Ste. Marie, that particular problem has been replaced or supplanted with 1,001 other kinds of false teachings around the world today. And it's the job of church leaders, whether it's an enjoyable thing to listen to or not, it's our job to confront error head on and to explain what's wrong with it and to contradict it according to the Scriptures. And so that's one of the reasons why I've chosen to do what I'm going to do this morning in the Sunday school portion of our time together. This is a study of evolution, because at 11 o'clock this morning I want to share with you a second segment in what I believe the Christian worldview is, and that is that Christians have to believe in creation. Now I wanted to take the time this morning to deal with the subject of evolution because I don't think that we've actually done any preaching on it here. Secondly, many of you are parents and your children are going through the educational system where they most of the time are encouraged by their science teachers, by other teachers, people in authority, people who give documentaries on television, and people all around them in authoritative positions. Your children are being influenced to accept as fact the doctrine of evolution. You, as parents, when you were children, were probably taught evolution. I know I was, and and there is very little countering done in the public school system in particular against the teachings of evolution. Now that's not to say that creationism is never taught, but it's certainly a minority viewpoint, and there's a very few number of teachers that actually believe in creation. Now this another couple of words I have to say by introduction this morning. All right, I am not a scientist, as you all know. I do not know these things from first-hand experience. I have to depend on experts for my knowledge, and that's where books and libraries come in. And what I've attempted to do is to put down a few statements of fact this morning in a summary form, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. It's just the first 15 points that I came across. All right? It's not put in any particular order either. But here are a number of specific reasons why the doctrine or the teaching of evolution is to be objected to both on theological and practical and moral and scientific grounds. I've put down under each one of these points the source material where I got this, so that if your young people in school are interested in or need information, want to get material to write papers and themes and so forth for their studies, that you can you can write off to Institute Creation Research and ask to be put on the mailing list for Acts and Facts, where this little article, where this regular feature comes all the time. I think it doesn't cost you anything. It's free. Of course, it costs them money to send it out, and probably Christians should give a donation to cover, the mailing costs. But this is they're called Vital Articles on Science and Creation, Impact, and basically they're authored by the scientists at Heritage Christian College and Institute for Creation Research in El Cajon, California. People who are right in the forefront of the creation evolution debate today, and these people know what they're talking about, right? And of course they'll also feature articles by theologians and people in other departments. For instance, I have one here called The Chinese Language in the Creative Hands of God by Ethel Nelson, who's a medical doctor. So they're not necessarily scientists in the physical sciences aspect as well. All right, I just put that down so that if anybody's interested, you can pursue it a little farther. I think one of the problems that Christians face is that they don't believe in evolution, but it's very difficult to get your hands on good articles, source materials with which to back up your objections. And I brought along with me 2 or 3 very plain, simply written pamphlets on the creation-evolution debate. This is called The Bone of Contention, Is Evolution True? Written by a lady who has her master's in science. These two are related. This is Casebook 1 and Casebook 2. Ken Ham and several other scientists are involved in writing against evolution. The case against evolution, the case for creation. Can't get it much more basic than that. Right? The relevance of creation. These are really good articles. And if somebody wants to photocopy them or get the addresses to write off for them, I would encourage you to do so. Right? Because your young people, if your children are only in grade 3, sooner or later they're going to have to learn about evolution, and they ought to be taught what evolution is. They should know what it is so that they know why they don't believe it. Right? It's very difficult to explain what evolution is today because there are a multitude of theories. In my research for this particular study this morning, this was just compounded over and over. It was re-emphasized for me. What do you think evolution is? Anybody here want to venture a definition of what evolution is? And I'm not going to laugh at you because I'm no expert, right? Let's have a starting place. Somebody tell me what you think evolution is. Paul. Process of change. Okay. So apples change. Is that evolution?
You got it.
You got it. We're not talking about fruit. What are we talking about? Why is evolution a problem?
Theory that man evolved from a creature.
Okay, it's the theory trying to explain man's origins. That's the problem of it. Okay. Now, Paul gave us a real basic definition. Right, evolution is nothing more than a process of change. That's important. That's the basic concept. But the problem with evolution, the theory says that this is where man came from. He changed from what he was into what he is. Right? Okay, now, the specific examples of evolutionary theory are a multitude. I could have probably only defined 2 or 3 for you this morning, but some of the ideas are down here in these lists. So I think we'll take the time to start going through this. I know you can read as well as I can, but rereading it will be good for me, and it might bring to mind other illustrations. All right? Why I don't believe in evolution. Now, if you don't agree with some of these ideas, fine, you can take your pen and stroke them out, okay? Maybe they don't mean anything to you, but they mean something to me. This is personal this morning, okay? Number 1, I don't believe that there is any evolution at present. Nobody's ever seen evolution happen. and at least in the sense of Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin is the man that basically formulated the evolutionary theory back in the middle of the 1800s. This man was an Englishman. He was working in the sciences. He was born and raised as an Orthodox Christian. He left his basic viewpoints as a young man, began to read other people, and started to formulate his own theories. Charles Darwin theorized that over billions of years, all the various species that we see today have evolved or changed in the process from one basic species. Okay? So all the family groups and all the different breakdowns within the family groups all came from a simple cell or something over a great period of time. And of course, it's impossible to give an example. And the nice thing about some of these quotations that are given here in the impact articles is that these are quotations not from creationist scientists, but from evolutionary scientists themselves. Notice, this is what an evolutionist said. Evolution, at least, in the sense that Darwin speaks of it, cannot be detected within the lifetime of a single observer. And if you want to find out more about that, about the terminology there, then I can give you the particular article if you want to read it. Right? Has anybody heard of an example of evolution? There are examples that people use, but they're discredited examples. There's a moth, for instance, it's found in Europe, I think, in England. It's called, I forget what it's called, but it changes color depending on where it's found, right? Just kind of like a chameleon, right? Sitting on a tree, and it'll change color. So the evolutionist looks at some of these examples and say, there's an example. Right? The problem is that you go back in time, and these seeming evolutionary examples are always the same, right? In the rocks. Teeth. Right. Okay. So that's said to have been an intermediate form between reptiles and birds. All right. This example. The problem is that some Japanese fishermen caught one in their nets a couple of years back. Right. It's which. I know there's fossil remains, but somebody actually caught one in a net, or drug it up out of the ground, or not out of the ground, but out of the ocean. At least I read that once. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not really prepared to say anything against that specific example because I don't know enough about it. Okay, but anyway, it merits further research. A second reason is that no new species have originated. Colin Patterson, a world-renowned evolutionist that I cited last week in the message, said that no one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has gotten near to doing so. All right? Basically, it's just a refinement of the first point. Thirdly, there is no known mechanism for evolution. A mechanism is an actual means whereby something actually changes, and nobody knows how evolution works. Evolutionists that want to believe it constantly say over and over that it's true, they're just not sure how it works. It's called a central mystery. In some of these further points, you're going to hear of some of the terms that they use to describe the mechanism for evolution, or the theory of the mechanism for evolution. They used to believe that it was natural selection and mutation. All right? That was the so-called way that evolution takes place. Right? Now, in the science of genetics, they have disproved mutation as being a possible means of evolution, because mutations are always you end up with monsters, things that can't live, things with 2 heads or 16 arms, or and so these monsters that which are a mutation or an abnormality, they in themselves are unable to reproduce or unable to to cope with the added problem that they're born with. And instead of being a positive step upward, it's always a negative step backward. That's the problem with mutations. Creationists believe that, at least the creationist scientists believe, that natural selection is in fact observable, but only within species. You don't have selection within horses crossing over into reptiles, let's say. There isn't, one family doesn't changes within one family don't affect changes within other families. That's what they found. And so natural selection and mutation doesn't work. That's just doesn't work as a mechanism for evolution. Number 4, there is no fossil evidence of a single transitional form. One evolutionist has written, the known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution accomplishing a major morphologic transition. Morphology is the forms of creatures. So there's not one single example in the fossils of a major evolution from or transition in the forms of from one family to another. Now, these guys couldn't say things like this if there actually was evidence. There are evidences of certain changes between within families, within species rather. For instance, you can have horses that are 16 hands high, and then you can have horses the size of dogs. They're still horses. There's been changes. There's been 101 different kinds of dogs bred and developed over the years, but dogs are dogs. Okay? Dogs are dogs. And there's no fossil evidence of one transitional form. The examples that have been put forward as examples of change of transitional forms, the missing links between these families, have all been discredited. Fifthly, there is no general evidence of evolutionary progression in the order of the actual fossil sequences. One of the basic presuppositions of paleontology, which looks at all the rocks and the fossils in the rocks, is that all around the world, what all the rocks tell us is that there are different ages in which different kinds of fossils are to be found. Right? That's their assumption. That's part of the theory of evolution. Right? The problem is that when you actually look at the evidence, it's all screwed up. It's mixed up. Right? They find a few years back down in Texas. Now they've backed up on this, but this isn't the only example I can think of because I'm not well schooled in this. But the fossils of men are very young compared to the fossils of some of the dinosaurs, for instance. Okay, fossils, by fossils we mean footprints or actual bones or whatever, right? So down in this, they're supposed to be separated by millions of years, and then they find places where man and dinosaurs are found in exactly the same rocks sediment, right? And that screws up their geologic timetable, right? And there's no, when you put all the evidence together, the evolutionists themselves are saying it doesn't make sense. There's, we thought it did at one time, but it doesn't make sense. It's all mixed up. There isn't even a general scheme available, right? When you take all the evidence into consideration. Stephen Gould, who is who is considered by the ICR creationist scientists as being the foremost evolutionist in North America today, at number 5, this is what he says. I regard the failure to find a clear vector of progress in life's history, and he's referring to all the rocks and everything in the fossils, as the most puzzling fact of the fossil record. We have sought to impose a pattern that we hoped to find on a world that does not really display it. And this is the top dog saying this kind of stuff. You know, we thought that there was a geologic timetable. Sorry. Okay? Number 6, there is no evidence that evolution is even possible. Do you know what the second law of thermodynamics is? Can somebody tell me what the second law of thermodynamics is? Go ahead, Sid. That's the first law. Second law? Come on, you teachers. Right. Go from complex to simple, go from higher to lower. Everything's rusting out and going downhill rather than getting better. That's called entropy. Okay, entropy is just a word for things go from organization to disorganization. If you leave your car out in the parking lot for 15 years, you'll end up with a pile of rust. It doesn't turn into a magnificently new, right? Now, this is one of the fundamental, most proved laws of science is the second law of thermodynamics. Everywhere observable in human beings, in animals, in the stars. I saw a part of this happen last night. I was standing out looking at the aurora borealis and I saw a falling star. Why wasn't it going up? Right? Because it was dying. It came in and it died last night. See? And it doesn't happen the other way around. Okay? Every once in a while the scientists will discover a new nova or something. That's a starburst, right? And basically what it is the death of a star. Something exploded. Okay? Billions, millions, or thousands of light years away. Way out there. The light is just now getting to us. Something happened. It blew up. It didn't create, didn't start. Okay? So, all around us, the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is running down, contradicts the basic premise of evolution that the whole universe has evolved upward from a single primeval particle to human beings. Now, the evolutionists respond to that and say that our universe must have started in a closed system. In a closed system where you can control what happens, you can go from disorder to order. You can create something or form something more profitable, see, more complex in a closed system. The problem is they have trouble explaining where the closed system came from. Okay, so second, this is one of the really basic objections. Along with the fossil record hasn't given them any examples of transitional species, to the fact that the second law of thermodynamics completely is a mystery to them, how it can fit together with evolution. Number 7, similarities between organisms does not support evolution. One evolutionist has said, it is now clear that the pride with which it was assumed that the inheritance of homologous structures, that is, similar structures from a common ancestor, explained homology was misplaced. They're simply saying that just because a man kind of looks like a monkey and kind of looks like an ape, right, that we have hand-like appendages and feet-like appendages and that semi-upright, that this idea of just because two different species look similar is no proof. And basically what they've done, the way they've disproved this, by the way, is this is a very recent thing, is that they have now been able to break down the structure of the DNA, what makes up cells, right? And they can actually compare protein and amino acid chains that make up the basic DNA of every different kind of species. And they can compare what an amino acid for saliva is for a human to that of a horse, to that of a pig, to that of a bird, to that of a fish. And they can compare all these things, and they can show that that things that look alike aren't alike. When you break it right down to the essential components, they're completely opposite. They're just not alike at all. Just because they look alike doesn't make them alike. The building blocks of matter are very different. Number 8, the old arguments about recapitulation and vestigial organs showing earlier evolution in humans are discredited. Now, I had to learn what recapitulation was to be able to write this paragraph. But recapitulation theory basically is that they look at the development of the fetus in the womb. And you know how that it, you know, I don't know how many weeks, you know, there is, you know, a weird shaped thing with an eyeball in it, right, in the womb, you know, and then weeks later, then you begin to have little bumps on the blob, right, and then a few weeks later, it starts, you know, you have other forms. It just changes. It evolves, if you wish, to use the primary definition. It changes through a process within the womb. And so one of the theories was, the recapitulation theory was that this is evidence of how the human species has, you know, this is what we look like before. All right? And so this recapitulates, it kind of re-illustrates the evolution that the human species has gone through. And of course, they've discredited that. Vestigial organs. You know what a vestigial organ is? It's like little kids that are born with a tail or things like that. That's really was at one time tremendously touted as being evidence that we definitely were descended from the apes because they've got tails, or the monkeys because they've got tails. Right? The problem is that you know, the real answer for vestigial organs is things gone screwy with oh boy, with the genetic makeup of an individual, right? And it's always like, if they, to use an example that I was reading this morning, there have been many children, you know, example, hundreds of children born with little tails, right? And so when the tails of children are compared with the tails of other creatures, you know, there is no similarity. You know, the tail of a child will be nothing more than fatty tissue or gristle, whereas the tails of other organisms are, you know, actually have vertebrae and bone structures, and if those creatures end up having tails without it, they die. You see, like it's a mutation downwards for them. And so if there's any similarity, it's a destructive case in both situations. Right? It's not an example of evolution. It's not a transitional stage. You know, I was reading also, they were poking fun at the evolutionists on this basis. They were saying that if vestigial organs prove evolution, and the examples that the evolutionists want to take is that, you know, tails prove that we're related to the monkeys because monkeys have tails. Well, what about baby girls that are born with mammary glands under their armpits like bats, you know, or mammary glands in the groin area like whales? You know, I mean, and there have many cases of people born with these deformities, you know. And if you want to go on the basis of vestigial organs, then why take it back to the monkeys? Why not take it to the whales or to bats? You see, and it's impossible. They're destructive mutations is what they are. All right, so vestigial organs has been discredited, and they don't believe that anymore. Okay. Another one is design in nature could not have been brought about through any method involving chance, but rather only through intelligent design. Donald DeYoung, in one of these articles, gave 2 or 3 examples. He says that if you just study the mass of the proton is the positive charge in the center of every atom. I think that's what it is. If I got that right, correct me if I'm wrong. I think a proton is the nucleus of the atom, right? It's positively charged. And can you conceive of protons evolving? I mean, it had to come from somewhere, right? They too had to be part of the evolutionary process. It's impossible for a proton to have evolved because of its very, you know, chance could not have done that because there would have been the collapse of the universe. Or the gravitational force could not have evolved or changed, because if it had, the planets would have smashed into one another, because of the changing values. There would have been total self-destruction of the universe. Another example that I remember Gary Parker using was the bombardier beetle. Any of you ever remember him saying something about that? There's a beetle found in the deserts out in California called the bombardier beetle. And basically, its basic self-defense system is that it stores up gas in its abdomen, and when some threatening predator comes too close, it blows up. It doesn't blow up, but it blows a real hot blast of nauseous gas at the predator. Something like a skunk, only, this is really powerful, just pow, that sort of thing. Now, Gary Parker used the illustration. He says, can you imagine a bombardier beetle evolving? He says, they've been blowing themselves up for millennia. How come how come you could get two that didn't blow themselves up at the right time, at the same time, coming together? The odds of something like that are just impossible, right? So there are many examples in nature where chance is simply impossible. The odds are totally against the possibility of evolution actually happening. It had to be creative design. All right. We're out of time this morning, but you ought to read through some of these other examples. Number 15 was one of the most interesting. It gives examples of how the evolutionists date the world at so many billions of years. Fundamental to the theory of evolution in all its forms is great masses of time. You have to have great amounts of time for evolution in any of its forms to take place. The problem with that is that you can look at the magnetic field of the world today, and every 100 years the magnetic field of the world depletes by 5%. Well, you can only back up so many thousands of years to where there wouldn't have been, or the magnetic field would have been so strong to have affected the Earth's relationship to the other planets and things like that. It would have screwed itself up. So it can't be as old as they theorize. It has to be younger, and there are other examples. The evolutionary scientists, when Apollo was going to the moon, predicted that the moon was so old, so many billions of years old, that the lunar dust that would have been attracted to that body in space would have been so deep that it was very likely that when the astronauts landed on the moon that they would be swallowed up in a quicksand of lunar dust. And the creationist scientists disagreed and said it's only a few inches thick. Of course, we all know how deep it was, about this deep, right? And so the predictions based on vast ages of evolutionary time were shown to be false in that particular example and many others. Right? Now, I know, it's inevitable that my explanation of the problems with evolutionary theory are going to be insufficient and dissatisfying. And if I would just urge you to, as parents and as Christians and as teachers and those who have influence, trying to answer the questions of children who are having to deal with this theory, you should inform yourselves a little bit better. At least, if nothing else, if you don't want to study it, at least get good information in your homes that is ready available to those who are going through the issue in their time. Right? So I encourage you to get a hold of this kind of stuff. Write off to